Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ahead of the Curve number 3. We're excited to share this time with you today, and it's going to be really fascinating. Max Valiquette is Diamond's Chief Strategy Officer. Having worked with some of the biggest brands at some of the largest agencies over the past 20 years, Max is one of Canada's best-known consumer and brand strategists. He even founded his own award-winning firm, Youthology. He has contributed to a range of publications, from Strategy Mag, to the Wall Street Journal, to MTV, to National Public Radio. And as CSO at Diamond, Max leads a team of strategists who provide actionable insights into how consumers think and act and what it takes for brands to succeed. I have personally worked with Max for many years. If you are joining today, it is likely because you know he is equally as knowledgeable as he is entertaining in the way that he speaks. And so today will be no exception, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Hello, Max.
All right, everyone. So this is Ahead of the Curve. This is Generation C for Generation COVID. It's marketing to generations X, Y, and Z and how it's changed. A disclaimer, this deck is built for informational purposes only, and this is not a medical document. All information provided throughout this presentation has been sourced from accredited sources. The information and opinions expressed are the opinions of the author. I'm the author, and in no way represent what will happen, only what might happen based on the research and publication of the various accredited sources. This document should be used to help with the planning during this unprecedented and uncertain time. Now that we've got all that out of the way, hi, I'm Max, and I'm from Diamond. I was from Youthography. So I bring this up because in the 25 years or so that I've been involved in marketing, I've spent most of them trying to understand young people. For a while, owning and operating my own firm called Youthography. And then you turn 40 plus and it gets kind of creepy to be focusing exclusively on young people. But I've always had this great passion in youth culture and youth marketing. And I'm hopefully going to be bringing all of that to the table, not just what we've learned over the past couple of months, but in fact, what I've learned in the couple of decades leading up to this. And this is a presentation about youth marketing. So I feel a little bit weird right now talking about this because it is a very uncertain time and it does feel like things are really changing and who knows what is happening. But the world, hopefully for us, keeps on moving forward. And so this is what we do. We talk about the context of something, whether it's great or small. And we have an awful lot of context to talk about today in terms of young people and COVID and what it means to us. Now, typically, I focus on two generations of youth. That's Gen Y or millennials who we say were born between 1980 and 1996. And that's also Generation Z, the generation that follows them, who were born between 1996 and 2015. These are two generations that have been discussed more than any others, I would say, in all the time that we've been talking about marketing to young people. It's interesting for me because I'm a member of Generation X, and I've actually never really gotten to talk about Generation X, which is honestly the most Generation X thing you could ever possibly say. Like, here's a couple of tweets by a couple of Generation X types that blew up in the last month. It's Generation Xers very publicly talking about how invisible they are and addressing millennials and boomers while they do it, while they just get crazy traction on Twitter. That's Gen X in a nutshell. So look, I'm hating this pandemic and I'm hating this isolation as much as I think most of us are. And I don't want to sound like that one person, you know, who's used this time to get like super in shape and personally repaint their house while the rest of us are essentially just carbs and Netflix. But this is actually a super exciting time for the nerdy cultural anthropologist in me and for the narcissist in me, because finally it's a moment for Generation X to be front and center. I mean, sure, it's taken a global pandemic for this to happen, but after decades of millennials and Generation Z just dominating all of the headlines, we're finally getting this. And pay attention to some of the language that we're seeing in these articles that say things like Generation X is better equipped than millennials and better prepared than any other generation to deal with this pandemic right now. For the first time since the ascent of millennials in the late 1990s and the explosion of youth marketing, Generation X is front and center amongst younger than boomer generations. And this demonstrates a kind of moment-relevant mindset that other cohorts can only aspire to. That's happened for the first time ever in my career studying young people. And then this, the highest honor of them all, memes. Gen X got memes. We never get memes. And look, we got memes with Devo, and we got memes with the original Red Dawn. I think as soon as you get memes with Swayze, you know something really crazy is happening. Like the expression goes, mo Swayze, mo crazy. And even memes with Reality Bites, which I think is probably the most Gen X-y of any movie ever. I mean, I know it's Wednesday, not Friday, but time is a blur right now and days no longer have any meaning. And I thought I was on a roll with this whole meme thing. So I thought I would come in and do this. But here's what I'm noticing for the first time ever. I've never seen a youth cohort make a comeback. We never get to talk about how we acted when we were teenagers 30 years ago as if it's cool right now. That's not how it works. Usually it's whatever younger generation is dominant in the moment, making fun of those of us who used to be young. That's where whatever Karen and okay boomer have come from, right? It's teenagers calling Gen Xers Karen as a way to dismissively say that they've gotten too old, or millennials saying okay boomer as a way to say that older generations are out of touch. And it happens when we seem to be way too proud of our youthful past or when we were younger. So this is an article about Gen Z calling Gen X the Karen generation, and it actually uses reality bites in a negative way, while Gen Xers right now feel confident enough to use reality bites in a positive way. This is literally a screen cap from a parliamentary session in New Zealand in which a 25 or 26-year-old politician was putting forth a climate response plan. And she faced some opposition from an older rival politician, and she shut him down just by saying, okay, boomer, this is how it's supposed to be. The younger generation's dismissing anyone even older than they are. So I was wondering, what is happening right now? Is it actually possible that Gen X is making a comeback? I was thinking, should we start a company called Middle Ageography, or should I get ready to buy Big Shiny Tunes, volumes 9 through 47 or something? I'm thinking, is this generation, Gen X, about to supplant millennials and Generation Z as the coolest generation out there? No, we're not. But there is something really interesting happening in youth marketing in this moment right now, and that is that something has changed. And we can't tell you if it's going to change forever or if it's going to change back, but we can say this. For the first time in my career anyway, I think it's instructive to not just look at 2 generations of young people, but actually to look at 3. When we think of understanding youth in a post and during COVID world, we can look at the past, the present, and the future all at once with a broader lens. Since everything feels so uncertain, we should be addressing young people according to first principles that hopefully transcend any one generation of young people and in fact connect to what it means to be young, period. So we're going to look at these 3 cohorts of young and younger people together. And we're going to do that in 4 areas. We're going to talk about how the kids were all right. We're going to talk about extended adolescence. We're going to talk about digital natives. And we're going to talk about Generation C for Generation COVID. We're going to start with youth and youth marketing pre-COVID. The 20 years before COVID were the golden era of youth marketing, and these were dominated by one particular group, millennials. Millennials dominated the entire conversation even before we were calling them millennials. William Strauss and Neil Howe coined the term millennial all the way back in 1987 to describe a generation that they thought the eldest of whom would be graduating high school right around the turn of the millennium. But it wasn't until Time magazine wrote a cover story on millennials in 2013 that the term really took off, as this graph from Google shows. But that's really just a name. We've been speaking about this group, and we've been speaking to this group for quite a while. And we've certainly been marketing to them. But millennials didn't invent youth marketing. As much as it might seem for some of us like things really took off around the turn of the millennium, where millennial marketing really picked up, we've been marketing to young people as long as we sort of had these real cohorts of young people, which isn't as long as people think, but has still been a while. Consideration of young people as a viable and valuable demographic for brands and marketers started with boomers and has only grown since then. You can actually trace this across covers of Time magazine. What's really interesting to look at here is the general downward trend. We're naming generations when the generations are younger than ever before. We're talking about what makes them different at an earlier and earlier age than ever before. In the late 1960s, Time talked about the under 25-year-old generation. But in 1990, they started to talk about 20-somethings when Gen Xers were around 20 years old. And they talked about how Gen Xers were older by the time they were 27, 7 years later. They started to talk about older millennials in 2005, but younger millennials in 2013, and even in 2020, talking about Generation Z. So what we're noticing is that we talk about young people as powerful cohorts at a younger and younger age than ever before. I'm not sure that this means that 10 years from now, the cover person on Time magazine is going to be like 8 years old or something, but you'll notice that they're getting younger. This is interesting, and this is really important. And by the way, if you are 17 and you are happen to be turning into this webinar right now, I'll explain to you what Time magazine was when this whole thing is done. I'll actually tell you what magazines were, period. So that's really important, because one of the things a really good youth brand tries to do is not seem like it's older people trying to connect with younger people. In fact, that's the kiss of death for a youth brand. It's got to feel for youth by youth, and it should feel the opposite of this scene from 30 Rock with Steve Buscemi saying, "How do you do, fellow kids?" Great youth brands are future focused and entrenched in community. This is what we know about them. In fact, great youth brands for decades have been future focused and entrenched in community. I think Coca-Cola hit the gold standard for building a great youth brand about half a century ago. And how we execute against these insights might have evolved, but the principles still hold true. A great youth brand is focused on the future and it's entrenched in community. It seems a little mean, I guess, right now to play an ad that shows a complete disregard for every single kind of social distancing norm we're supposed to be observing. But since we're looking at the past, why not? And there is a reason why the greatest TV drama of all time, in my opinion, Mad Men, ended with this, which is what I think one of the greatest ads of all time is. And it's Coda, because this was a truly groundbreaking piece of youth marketing, and it far predates any millennials being born. It ticks all the boxes we would expect to see in a great brand spot aimed at young people today. Attainable, but aspirational, groundbreaking in content and in execution, but most importantly, focused on the future with a community of young people looking ahead. In this case, literally a community of young people looking ahead. Future focused and entrenched in community. But future and community are two words that have had their very meanings transformed by COVID. So we should ask ourselves, as times are changing, why do these words matter so much to young people? Why do the concepts that they represent matter so much to young people? And how has that changed? And how can we possibly connect to young people in a world where the meaning of these words has been fundamentally transformed? Well, we have to go back and ask ourselves why. Why does this matter so much? And it matters because of this notion of extended adolescence and the prolonged pre-adult life stage. This is something that I've talked about before, but if you haven't heard me talk about it, hopefully you'll like this. And if you have, just bear with me for a second. It's the single most important thing I can tell you about understanding young people, which is that the notion of adolescence is a relatively recent concept. We have all come of age in the past X number of decades, a time of which a notion of being a teenager or an adolescent, not a kid, but not a grown-up, was already well entrenched. Teenager is actually a relatively new term. You can see Google Ngram study of it here, and you'll see the word teenager didn't really appear in our lexicon until after the 1940s, and it only really started to take off in the 1950s and 1960s, essentially as the first boomers became teenagers. And with the advent of rock and roll culture and youth culture in the 1960s, we started to hear more about teenagers. But before then, it wasn't really seen as being this viable life stage. It was this awkward part between being a kid and being an adult, and it didn't really stand for as much of anything. Adolescence is a relatively new concept. That's a difficult thing for some of us to imagine, but it truly is. And adolescence used to be a very short period of time. So if adolescence is a relatively new concept, extended adolescence is an even newer one. And that's what I mean when I talk about the prolonged pre-adult life stage. It's that our young people are now partly, not fully, but partly growing up earlier than ever before. There's a study that's just over a decade old now that has been updated, and it's called The Falling Age of Puberty in U.S. Girls. It's about the falling age of puberty in U.S. girls. And it's a comprehensive medical study that shows that we're actually literally hitting puberty at an earlier age, literally growing up faster. We're not exactly sure why. People talk about hormones in the food that we eat, or the fact that we're a larger populace than ever before. We consume more at an earlier age than ever before. It seems to be jumpstarting our bodies, but we appear to literally be physically growing older at an earlier age than ever before. We're also overscheduled, so much so now that our doctors are prescribing playtime for kids because we're taking that part of their childhood away. And then we put pressure on them to make choices at an earlier age than ever before. We tell our kids that the decisions they make, the courses that they're going to take when they're in grade 9 are going to have an impact on the rest of their lives, even though they're going to live another 80 years after that. Something that I find kind of hilarious because about 3/4 of the thing that I do for a living weren't invented when I was in grade 9. But now here we are putting all of this pressure to grow up faster on our kids, whether it's happening physically or emotionally or societally. We are partly growing up earlier than ever before, but we're making the full transition to adulthood at a later age than ever before. For the first time ever, we have a generation of young people who actually are getting fewer driver's licenses per capita or getting them at a later age than ever before. And that used to be one of the huge milestones of becoming older, right? So was graduating college or university, which compared to 50 years ago, we do 3 or 4 years later. So was getting married, which I get as a sort of common heteronormative standard of this, but this is what we used to look at. And the average age of first marriage in Canada or the United States was about 25 or 26 years old. That was about 25 years ago. And now it's like 30. We've added 3 or 4 years onto that milestone of getting older. And the same thing with having kids, where we used to do that when we were in our mid-20s, and now we do it at 29 or 30 as well. In a very short period of time, we've taken this concept of being a teenager and having an adolescence and stretched it out from being a very small period of time to being a very long period of time. This notion of not yet a woman, I think Brittany's got most of the answers, not all of them. Don't have her light candles in your gym, but she's got all of the other answers. So this prolonged stage of pre-adulthood was already at its most prolonged, but at least there was this sense of forward movement, right? You could be living at home and going to school and working part-time, and you could kind of know what you were going to do with your life, but not fully know what you were going to do. And you could have a cell phone and text with it. You could have a boyfriend or girlfriend. You could be drinking beer. You could be in social media, and you could be 15 or you could be 29. But there would still be some sense of forward progress because there was a future for you to move towards, even if that progress was slow as it's ever been. Now, what promise for the future can a brand make when so much of the future has actually been canceled? We're talking about students who can't go to their prom, a huge milestone that people have been waiting for 4 years, but it's not going to happen this year unless it's a weird socially distant Zoom prom that someone's doing. We're talking about things like entering a workforce, which has seen the unemployment rate skyrocket in the past 2 months. There goes another promise of the future. And even the sense of when this will all be over and when we get back to some sense of either a new normal or a different version of normal that contains some elements of the old normal, or maybe we just go back to as it were, no one actually knows. And so young people don't even have a sense of the path that they should be going down. That makes it very difficult for brands that were always built on a promise of the future. How does a brand put a whole bunch of young people on a mountaintop and ask them to look into the future when there is no future for us to look into right now? I want to contrast this with the ultimate bit of millennial marketing from about 20 years ago. And that is a Spice Girls ad for Pepsi. When the Spice Girls were at the height of their powers, Pepsi commissioned them to be one in a long series of youth spokespeople types. And here they all are doing their thing. This is a song they wrote, or was probably written for them, that literally had the line, "Move Over" was the title of the song. And it ended with the refrain, "Generation Next," which curiously enough just happens to be the Pepsi slogan. It's actually just like the Coca-Cola Hilltop commercial. You've got a mixed group of young people. They are singing a song, the lyrics of which exalt us to come together, but ask for adults to get out of the way or move over so that young people can do something like teach the world to sing. That's what youth marketing looks like. Whether it's 1970 and Coca-Cola on a hilltop or whether it's 1997 and Spice Girls. The only difference is the Spice Girls are saying literally move over. It's gotten that much more explicit. They're not saying I'd like to teach the world to sing, which is a little bit softer, but it's the same sentiment. That's probably because Posh shouldn't be teaching anybody how to sing, although maybe it's those who can do and those who can't teach. Anyway, no brand could do this or its equivalent right now, because a critical part of marketing is that promise of the future and a role for them in it. And we don't know what that future is. So we can't say generation next. We can't say move over. But there is still the idea of community, right? We said entrenched in community and future focused. And if future focused isn't working, the possibility is maybe then to be community entrenched. And that fundamentally comes down to digital now. This is a quote from a guy named Jaron Lanier, and it's almost 25 years old. And he said, "We already knew that kids learned computer technology more easily than adults. What we're seeing now is that they don't even need to be taught. It's as if children were waiting all these centuries for someone to invent their native language." I love that quote, and I love sharing that quote because he wrote this in like 1997. And he understood something fundamental, that this wasn't just a piece of technology, or it's not just the internet. It's literally a language, and we use language to create community, and that's what young people do. And all three of the generations we're talking about are digital natives, but in a different way. If you're in Gen X, you can't really remember a world without a computer, but you can remember a world without the internet. If you're if you're in Generation Y, you can remember a world without smartphones, but probably not without the internet. And that computer is the reason why you're one of the overscheduled. And then if you're in Generation Z, you probably can't remember a world without smartphones. So this is, I think, a really critical slide to look at because it expresses that, yeah, we're all digital natives, but it's slightly different. I'm on that Generation X group, and I work in youth marketing, and I still find the fact that like 98% of young people have access to a smartphone is whenever they want to is an amazing stat to me. And I've been saying this for a while because I was from a generation that grew up with a phone in our room, which some of you may or may not remember a phone in your room. I always say it seems practically Amish now to say a phone in your room when people have a device on their person that lets them talk, text, or chat 24 hours a day. What I will say is that those of us who grew up without the internet but with computers took to the internet quite quickly. And so I will say that Gen X behaves a little more like Gen Y or like Gen Z than they do like boomers when it comes to how quickly we've embraced the internet and how much we've taken it into our everyday lives. And that comes from having some form of digital nativity. So that digital nativity directly corresponds to an ability to create community at a time when young people have never needed to create community more than ever. That's a pre-COVID thing. We have fewer young people in our homes to hang out with than any prior generation. When parents ask me how come it is that their kids come home from school and they're automatically on their phones talking to the friends they just saw at school, and they say, like, why is that? The answer is really simple. There are fewer kids your own age to hang out with in your own house. You may not have a brother or sister at all. And if you do, they may be 3 or 4 years removed from you. Families are smaller and families are spending less time together than ever before. As much as it doesn't feel that way right now, families were anyway spending less time together than ever before. So I think one of the reasons we saw this great rise of social media coming out of Generation Y was because they needed their friends to create that community more than ever before. They were on this newish journey of a very prolonged extended adolescence, needed to be able to connect to other young people on the same journey as they were, and didn't have the same kind of access to those young people in their houses anymore. And I think fundamentally that's the genesis of social media. Put that and digital nativity together, and here you go. So now we have a group of young people who can connect and commune whenever they want to, and not just to the people who are immediately close to them, but actually to people anywhere around the world. So that sense of community and the possibility of community is greater than ever before. And it's actually a possibility that's realized fully through social media, that whether you are X, Y, or Z, and reductively speaking, if you're a Gen X, you probably use Facebook more. And if you're a Y, Instagram may be your favorite thing. And if you're a Z, it's probably TikTok. You may start out hopping onto any one of these networks because you want to be performative, or you want to take a picture, or you want to share a skill that you're great at, or you're looking to schedule a party or whatever. But eventually it becomes about creating community. Every one of these apps eventually installs some kind of a messenger function and some kind of a group community or a group communication function, so that it is possible to connect both directly with one person and express yourself to a larger group of people as well. And those are fundamentally the two parts of community. So we know that this is still extremely important. And we know that young people have never been able to form the communities as they want or need to right now, as they can right now, but it's only digitally right now. This is what happens when you do a Google search for Coachella. It just tells you that it's been postponed, like the rest of youth culture and like the rest of the world, it feels like. So I think it's important that we recognize a couple of interesting but somewhat contradictory things here. There is that ability to create community, and it does happen digitally, but we don't actually know how to deliver on that promise in a non-digital way yet, as we don't know what that future holds. And so that's where we have to think about what's next. And here's the thing. Marketing is about context, especially marketing to young people. But the context is them. It's their lives. Brands need to respectfully and properly marry themselves to the journey that young people are on. Not any other context, but that context of that young person. They want brands to demonstrate an understanding of their context for the brand to come to them, essentially. So it's the difference between the Kendall Jenner Pepsi ad and a Colin Kaepernick Nike ad, where both of them are actually tackling a big, broad societal issue, trying to anyway, and both of them are dealing with something quite heavy that is a real issue in the world, but one of them understands context and one of them doesn't. One of them literally has the brand trying to solve something that it can. The brand inserts itself into a conversation it shouldn't be a part of. The other shows the brand properly inserting itself into that conversation. This was an ad about Nike and young people, and it addressed context properly. This was an ad about Pepsi that tried to marry contemporary context with the brand in a way that just didn't work. So ideally, a brand would find that the context it wants to find itself in and the context in the life of a young person are the same, and that's where brands can start to have contextual conversations. The problem is we have never had as much context as we do right now. And it's not the context of the lives of a young person. It's actually a broader societal worldwide context that is dominating everything. I'm sure some of you have seen this where someone put together a supercut of how every COVID-19 commercial feels exactly the same. And that's not against knock against the marketers who have done any of this work. It is that there is so much context going on that it's actually transforming our advertising into a sea of sameness because we are all using the same language and we are all saying the same things. Young people don't want that to happen. They don't want it to be about the context of a broader world. They want it to be about the context of the journey that they are on and the future that they are heading towards. That's why this is an ad about Coca-Cola that really works for young people. This is an ad about COVID brought to you by Coca-Cola. And it's not that Coke shouldn't be doing this. They said staying apart is the best way to stay united. And there is something about creating unity and a shared experience built into the Coca-Cola brand. But Coca-Cola can talk about that in 1970 in a way that makes it an ad about Coca-Cola and young people. In 2020, it's just going to be an ad about COVID until we stop directly talking about COVID. So we haven't seen the first post-COVID youth brand yet because we can't promise the future yet. But the first brands to figure it out will be putting young people front and center in their post-COVID world, not commenting on the world of COVID. And that's what I think I'd like to end on. We don't actually know where youth marketing is headed right now because we don't know where young people are headed. But the very best thing for the very next brand to do is to make sure that it's a conversation about young people and not a conversation about COVID, and that the brand is in there in the right way at the right time. That's it for me.
That's great. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for taking the time today. And Max, I want to thank you for talking about this. It was incredibly insightful. And I hope you all have a lovely day and a lovely rest of your week and a lovely long weekend.